Hello, and good to see you this evening.
Absolutely. Looking forward to wrapping up our Impala series. This is part 4, and we're going to wrap it up through the lens of predation pressure and how the intense predation on the impala has shaped this animal over the millennia.
Yes, well, I think that's a good central theme for understanding impala hood, because the impala is associated with the Great Rift system of East and Southern Africa, which means somewhat dry but very nutrient-rich ecosystems relative to the general standard for savannas in the world. And so I think it's fair to say that the impala lives in nutrient-rich savanna, which then has a certain amount of abundance of ungulates, which then supports a large abundance of predators. And so a salient characteristic of its habitat and its niche are that it lives under the gun of predation, perhaps more than most savanna-associated ruminants around the world.
Right, and when the habitat changes to, say, savanna on Kalahari sands, is that when impalas fall out of the system and springbuck move in?
Well, yes, that's true. Springbuck are also extremely adapted to predation, but that comparison is complicated by the water factor, because it's true that Kalahari sand is relatively poor in nutrients, but it's also much drier in most areas than the impala habitat.
Sure.
I think that the more instructive comparison is between the savannas generally associated with the Great Rift system in Eastern and Southern Africa on the one hand, and the more extensive, rather nutrient-poorer savannas extending across interior West Africa all the way from the Gambia, and then across north of the Congo Basin through to Chad and southern Sudan, and also the nutrient-poor savannas south of the Congo Forest Basin in places like Angola, Zambia, and to some degree Western Tanzania. So that's the more yeah.
And in those systems, the animal that's comparable to the impala is the cob. Is that right? Several species of cob.
Well, one species of cob, Cobus cob, which is a difficult animal to deal with, because it's got several different subspecies that function almost like different species. And so I think to keep matters simple, let's look at the West African subspecies of the cob, which is the one most similar to the impala in body mass. They're both about 50 kilograms in adult females. And it occurs over a wide range, this subspecies. Let's call it Buffin's cob. So the scientific name is Cobus cob. It's the nominated subspecies of the species Cobus cob. The English name is Buffin's cob. It's the same size and general shape and demeanor of an impala, and it's found in the savannas all the way from far West Africa through to around about Chad, which is a vast area, several thousands of kilometers.
And it would be easy to mistake Buffin's cob for an impala if you're just a casual tourist driving by, but there are some major differences that we can discuss and we can ascribe to predation pressure. Is that the general gist of our wrap-up?
Yes, well, everything is contextual, so you have to take different framings and different scalings. But let's put it this way. If it were the case that Buffin's cob occurred, say, in South America, in similar environments to the impala in Africa, then the evolutionary biologists would go nuts with this as an example of the perfect manifestation of evolutionary convergence, because for such creatures to be so similar on different continents, having evolved separately, would be just like the ultimate validation of how adaptation affects form and function.
Right.
Within Africa, it's less impressive, but the main point about it is that the initially impressive similarity between Buffin's cob and the impala, because they really do look very similar at a glance, is undermined by a surprising degree of difference when you look at the details. So that's the interesting thing. It's two things at once. It's uncomfortable for the mind to deal with because it's two different things simultaneously. It's simultaneously an impressive similarity and also a surprising difference. And the differences are much more interesting than the similarities.
Yeah, yeah. So what would you say are the main differences that could be ascribed to predation, differences in predation pressure? Of course, we're just speculating here.
Well, I'd say the impala is more gregarious for a start, and it's not only more gregarious; it's more obligately gregarious. So let's just sketch the setting, because most listeners will not be familiar, for all the obvious reasons, with the wildlife scene in West and North Central Africa. It's not a place that people visit for, and I don't need to describe why, really. There's aren't really any well-known game reserves there, and even the relatively good game reserves are not often visited by the kinds of people who visit the Kruger Park or the Serengeti. And what you're dealing with is a kind of a dissipated wildlife scene. I mean, there are endless thousands of kilometers of savannas in this region, but they're all kind of nebulous. They're not crisply differentiated into treeless grasslands and pockets of forest like you have in southern Africa. It's just a vast swathe of nebulous woodland on relatively flat, lateritized country, some drainage lines, some rivers like the Niger River going through, and all the game. There's quite a lot of game in that country, particularly in a cluster of transfrontier national parks and game reserves at the complex junction of countries such as Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Benin, and Nigeria. And on iNaturalist, for example, there are endless thousands of photographs that have been taken of game in that situation, but they're all on camera traps. Almost nobody ever photographs an animal in that vast transfrontier park system, which doesn't have a name as a unit, without setting a camera trap, because you can't just drive through the bush like you can in the Kruger Park and snap photographs of animals. It just doesn't work that way. Firstly, the vegetation is generally too dense, particularly in the summertime, the northern summer. And secondly, the game populations are just too sparse. And so we do know what lives there because of these camera trap systems, but you're dealing with a much more almost like diluted game abundance. And the predators correspond, because there are species such as the leopard, the lion, the spotted hyena, and so on. But again, you would never see them. You could probably spend weeks roaming that transfrontier park system in and near places like Burkina Faso and Benin without spotting a predator, because they're there, but they're secretive and they're sparsely populated.
Yeah, you're making me realize how lucky I was to see a West African giraffe in Niger. A couple of them once.
Well, there's only one population. There's only one population of the giraffe left in the entire vast swathe of savanna in West and North Central Africa.
Yeah.
Well, no, let me be more specific. There are some in places like Chad and Cameroon, I think, but west of, say, Lagos. Or west of Nigeria, there's only one population left, and that's a specific patch of savanna in southern Niger.
Yeah, and I drove through it and managed to see them. It was about 10 years back. Got some photos. I'll put it on the podcast.
That is absolutely wonderful. That's one of the strange. I mean, this is a bit of a digression, but it's worth going into. There's a strange thing about this particular population of this subspecies of giraffe called Giraffa camelopardalis peralta. Is that there's only one population and it's critically endangered, but the animals are completely habituated. It's like the local people could snuff them out any second, because if the local people started poaching them, they'd be gone tomorrow. But for some reason, they feel so safe in this limited last resort in the whole of the vastness of West Africa that if you actually visit that tiny little area, you can actually almost walk up to these giraffes. I don't understand how this has come about.
Well, I may have the reason, because the people who were taking me on this tour through Niger were government officials and UN officials, and they said that the president had issued a decree that if anyone kills one of their giraffes, it's the death sentence.
Well, yeah, that
and
explains it.
Yeah, yeah, they were protecting. The death sentence was handed out for giraffes in a freer manner than for human murder, was what my tour guides were telling me. So yeah,
that's
would explain
very interesting. That's interesting, and that unfortunately is what it will take in the longer term to keep that tiny little precarious remnant of the West African giraffe alive. It's almost gone. It's like on the brink of extinction, and only if it's protected that strenuously will it survive.
Yeah, in the Dosso region of southwest Niger.
And it's not even a national park or a game reserve. It's just just rangeland. It's just there's cattle all around and posts or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's decreed a reserve, but there are people living in it, and there are cattle posts everywhere. And it just felt like there are a few more trees, as I recall, but not too much different from the savannah. Yeah. So Baffin's cob is not nearly as gregarious as the impala, and we see the gregariousness of the impala as a very effective strategy for managing lion and wild dog. Why is that?
Well, let's just clarify a little bit more. There's two actual differences between Baffin's cob and impala. One is the gregariousness, one is the population density, and they kind of go together, but they're not exactly the same thing. So if you study a particular game reserve in West Africa, let's go to, say, Nyokolo-Koba in Senegal. That's one of the better-known reserves in West Africa. And you compare that with, say, I don't know, some game reserve in Eastern or Southern Africa. You take your pick, there's many. You'll find that the overall population density of Baffin's cob is probably only about 1/10 of what you'd find for the impala in your comparison. Okay. And then, given that is so, the animals are also less gregarious. So the average herd of Baffin's cob in Nyokolo-Koba might be 3 or 4, whereas it's obligatory for an impala to have a group or a herd of at least 20, if you're talking about females and young. Okay, so now coming back to your question. What is it about gregariousness that enables them to survive? Well, I think the answer is more or less the same as applying that question to ungulates generally, because many ungulates that live out in the open are gregarious. They manifest that gregariousness in different ways, but I think the biggest advantage is group vigilance.
Yeah.
So they're trying to help each other to spot the predator in good time.
But then the impala has what you've been calling a rubbing gregariousness. Rubbingly gregarious. I enjoy that term. And this rubbing nature of the impala is unusual compared with, say, zebra and wildebeest and other gregarious animals. So does that's of course something that the Baffin's cob doesn't do, this rubbing, I would assume. And so would you say the rubbing is an interesting aspect of the anti-predator gregariousness?
Yes, well, this is true, and this would be the hypothesis, is that not only does the impala act like a typical plains game as opposed to cover-dependent species in terms of being gregarious, obligately gregarious, not able to live without being in a group of a certain minimum size, but it goes that extra step of doing something that many plains game don't, which is to use that closeness, that proximity of one individual to the other as an actual way of confusing attacking predators. And I think it does that in two possible ways. One is that the animals aggregate so closely together that it's actually difficult for the scanning predator to distinguish one individual from the other, given their somewhat complex and confusing markings, which we call gregarious camouflage. In other words, camouflage against each other rather than against the vegetation. And then when they start moving, impalas are not like some other plains game species which go off in a single group in a single direction. They tend to flee in separate directions. This is a challenge to viewers. Find us a video or a photograph of a situation where impalas have been spooked by a predator and they've all fled together in a herd. I've never seen that. What I have seen is that they're rubbingly gregarious until they flee, and then they seem to forget all about the gregariousness thing, and they basically all take to the hills as individuals. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but would you agree based on the footage that you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. And so trying to get my head around this gregarious camouflage, it's difficult for them to make out individuals. I get that. And then when they scatter, it's a bit like a zebra coloration, which is meant to confuse and dazzle the predator. Is that what's happening? It's analogous to the zebra stripes, or not?
No, I don't see it that way in this context. Once the animal runs, once the impala runs, I don't think its coloration matters a jot.
Okay.
It's just that it's discombobulating to a predator when the group that it's confronting shatters and disintegrates.
Okay. So it's no longer the coloration. Once they split, it's not a coloration issue that's discombobulating. It's the explosion, as it were.
It's the sheer kinetics of suddenly discovering that if you haven't fixed on a particular individual, then you're kind of lost because you lose traction. You lose focus and you lose time, because the disadvantage of those plains game species that flee in a coherent group is that they can be tracked as a unit. Yeah, there are species like that. I think blesbok are like that. If you spook a herd of blesbok on the Highveld, and you don't see this anymore because blesbok don't exist anywhere with their full spectrum of natural predators. In fact, they hardly exist with any natural predator, even though they're quite an abundant animal in South Africa today on game farms and so on. But if you spook a herd of blesbok, I think from my experience that they all flee together. And I get that, if you're gregarious minded, then you flee together, because at some point when you stop, you're still together and you have all the vigilance advantage that brings. But impalas don't work that way. They seem to rely upon, firstly, making it difficult for a predator to assess who's vulnerable and focus on that as a target individual. And then once they start moving, they exacerbate that by producing a lot of distraction and a lot of confusion. So even if you've picked on an individual and want to follow it, you can't predict the direction it's going to go, and it's just a confusion strategy.
And Buffin's cob would probably be more like the blesbok.
Well, with cobs generally, let's take a little step back and look at cobs generally, because you have Buffin's cob in Western North Central Africa. Then you've got the Uganda cob, which is very familiar to people who've seen footage and photos from the Uganda national parks, like Queen Elizabeth and Murchison Falls. That's a very well-known animal that's often found out in the open grasslands in the lush savannas of western Uganda. And then you've got an extremely little-known species called the white-eared cob, which is remarkable in that it's still so abundant in South Sudan that it's perhaps the only ungulate outside the Serengeti ecosystem that has its entire Pleistocene original migration intact to this day, for the simple reason that South Sudan is so politically difficult that even hunters can't get into that animal's habitat in order to deplete its numbers. So you see, the cob is not just one thing. That makes the comparison more interesting, because the white-eared cob in Sudan is completely different from a Buffin's cob in being more like a true plains game animal and migrating. And then the Uganda cob is bigger and somewhat more boldly colored and so on. But when coming back to the Buffin's cob, we have no idea how it actually flees from predators, because there's nowhere in its vast range in which, even in the national parks and game reserves, you can actually study that relationship. It's too nebulous. It's too inaccessible. I don't think there's a single living wildlife biologist who's ever actually observed what Buffin's cob does when attacked by a predator. But I predict that it'll be a very generalized strategy. It'll be a kind of,
I see the white-haired cob is actually quite a dark, almost looks like a small sable antelope in its dark coloration.
Well, it's
males,
odd.
I think.
Yes, that's right. It's odd for the Cobus cob species in that it's the most sexually dimorphic in terms of coloration. The males go really dark. Yeah.
Okay, so we're not sure how the cob would respond to predators, but it's definitely not using rubbing gregariousness as a defense. And then, impalas are pretty unique, as we discussed in their locomotion. Escaping a predator, they're not only fleeing in all directions, but they're jumping over the lions, as I saw in the one clip, and then landing on their forelegs, and that's part of their unusual display to predators as well. So is this leaping and landing awkwardly on the forelegs, that's part of predation escape, but also displaying to the predator in another setting? Is that right?
I think it has to be a little bit more teased out than that. Okay, so the first thing to understand is that the impala bounds, as it were, leaps far in two different contexts, or in two different ways with two different functions. And neither of these occurs in the Buffin's cob. Okay, so let's get that clear. Buffin's cob does something to display to predators, and it's called stotting. Again, you won't find a single photograph anywhere in the world of a Buffin's cob stotting, even though it's perfectly capable of stotting by extrapolation from the Uganda cob, which has been, and the puku, which have both been filmed stotting. But let's assume that Buffin's cob stots, because that's just a parsimonious assumption. Nobody has ever seen that happen, because there's nowhere in the world where you can actually just observe it. But okay, so let's put that on one side. That's an unremarkable anti-predator display, because many different ruminants do that. They stot. The impala is in a different category. It does two different things that are different from a Buffin's cob. Number one is it kick-stots, and we discussed that in a previous segment. And that seems to be only in response to the African hunting dog. But it also bounds. And Buffin's cob does not bound. What bounding is that when the animal's galloping, it intersperses the galloping with basically leaping high and far, maybe 3 meters into the air and 10 meters long in a big arc, such that in the Kruger Park, sometimes if impalas are being chased on one of the main tourist roads, an individual will clear a whole rank of cars, just basically leap right over the road, over the cars, over the jeeps, over the four-wheel drive vehicles, and land on the other side. And impalas do this all the time. Now, you and I watched this spectacular footage from Matusadona National Park on the borders of Lake Kariba in northern Zimbabwe, where somebody who was out on a boat on the lake happened to be able to train his camera on this fleeing group of the impala being chased by a nice little group of lions. It was probably about 10 individuals of the lion. And what was spectacular was that this is how it seems that the impala evades the lion, even in ambush situations, because the individual impalas would just attempt to leap right over the lion. And it usually worked because even if the lion adroitly leapt up at the right second and snagged the impala with its sharp claws, the impala could still recover by falling in front of the lion, landing almost vertically on its 4 feet and quickly recovering and then accelerating again. So this seems to be a particular strategy of the impala. And we could say, at this point, we could draw back and say that there seem to be different strategies for different predators, which I don't think is true of Buffin's cob. So I suspect that in the case of the African hunting dog, the impala always kick-stots for some reason, but it doesn't do that for the lion. In the case of the lion, what it tries to do is to get out of harm's reach. But if it finds a lion anticipating it in front of itself, it tries to leap right over the lion, which is quite a big ask, because a lion is a big animal that can reach really high into the air by leaping up itself. And so you have to leap very high to get out of that. And even if the impala fails because it still gets snagged by that leaping lion, it still has a very specialized and remarkable capacity to recover from that disorientation and land even better than a cat on its front legs, and then not collapse or pause, but take off immediately again, so the lion can't catch it. We saw that on video. It was perfectly spectacular. And when we saw a particular individual of the impala fail at that, it was mainly because it had chosen a flight course too close to the edge of the lake where it was stony, and so it's it escaped that contact with the lion, but then stumbled because it ran out of space in which to flee. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. Would you agree that the kick-starting is a similar action to landing on the front legs?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. But you see, it is applied differently because it's not relevant in the context of actual escape from the African hunting dog, because the hunting dog doesn't hunt in the same way as the lion. It just basically wears the animal out. And, basically what the African hunting dog is doing, whether it's following as an individual or as a group, is it's trying to get a bite at the ankles of the animal, because as soon as it can contact the animal, it can actually start killing it. And so I don't understand why the impala wastes time and energy kick-starting for the African hunting dog. It should just get the hell out of there, as fast and as far as possible. But yet there seems to be some mind game going on where if the particular individual of the impala kick-starts convincingly enough, showing its fitness and its supreme agility, applying the agility in what is in that case an irrelevant way, because it's showing its ability to do what it does so effectively against the lion, which is land on its front feet. And even though that's not strictly relevant in the eyes of the hunting dog, it's still a hell of an impressive feat of agility and fitness. And so you see how complex all of this is.
No, absolutely. And it's of course impossible for us to have even have a vague sense of how the hunting dog is viewing the impala. But perhaps an analogy, if one plays at a professional level of tennis, if you're a tennis pro, you can pick up in a millisecond whether someone on a tennis court is an excellent player or a medium player. A very good player versus an excellent player. A pro can tell in a millisecond, just as the person swings back the racket, that the rest of humanity just won't know. They'll just see someone hitting a tennis shot, but the pro will know, okay, that guy's amazing and I'm in a battle to beat him, whereas that other chap, I'm going to take him out 6-love, but they'll look absolutely the same to 99.999% of humanity. And I'd imagine that must be what's going on with the hunting dog. They surveying the scene and they can pick up even the slightest lethargy or lack of vigor in an impala, and they'll know which one to home in on.
Yes, I think that's true, but it is predicated on a certain basis, which could be questionable, and that is that this is the idea that the African hunting dog, as a cursorial predator, absolutely insists on chasing a debilitated individual. This is the part that's hard for the human mind to wrap around. Okay, and that's because there's risk and reward involved. Okay, the African hunting dog is potentially capable of running down prey because it's got great speed and endurance. But it doesn't apply that randomly because it's got this very delicate risk-reward calculation in its head. And so it could just choose some random impala and take a go at it. But it doesn't work that way. What it does is it puts a lot of energy into finding the right individual. And if there's any doubt, it doesn't proceed, because it could theoretically get there and start crippling the animal by biting at its legs and so on. But there's risk involved. Just running through the bush is full of risk. And it also attracts other predators, and it's full of risk for the predator as well as for the prey. And so this is based on accepting the idea that, and this applies also to the spotted hyena and to the wolf and so on. All of these pursuit predators, they really are dependent upon looking at a group and sussing out who is vulnerable. And if any adaptation frustrates that, it really does matter to them. Now, in the case of the plain zebra, the way the plain zebra frustrates them is to have this shimmering pattern of stripes that actually distorts the body figure of the zebra. So you can't even tell if it's because your eyes are shimmering. In the case of the rubbing gregariousness of the impala, they're so close together in this milling group that you can't actually even distinguish one individual from another, because the patchwork, it becomes like a confusing blanket, you know. In the case of the explosive flight of the impala, you may have picked somebody, but he may go in a direction at odds with what you expect, and then there could be other animals crisscrossing him, and so it's difficult to keep track, right?
Yeah.
And then, does that make sense? So none of this really makes sense except in the context of this sort of selectivity. And then what seems to happen is that even if the hunting dog embarks on a chase of a particular chosen individual, if that individual kickstarts impressively enough, even at the expense of its own speed, the dog may decide to recant, to release, to let go, and to give up. Yeah. That's the only way I make sense of it. Because
okay, so are you also saying there that just a slightly less vigorous impala is not what they're after? They're looking for quite a debilitated one.
I'm not going that far. I think even a modest debility is grist to the middle.
Yeah.
Because it makes all the difference. It makes the reward risk equation more appealing. Because in an average group of impalas, you don't have a big differential in the fittest and the least fit. There's just slight differentials. I mean, you'd be very lucky as a pursuit predator, as a cursorial predator, to find an outright lame animal.
Yeah.
But what you are looking for is that differential. It's like, think of it in human economic terms as profit margins. I mean, many businesses in the world run on paper-thin profit margins. But those paper-thin profit margins are the difference between success of a business and failure of a business.
Yeah.
Because you don't need a big differential in order to work out on average as a living proposition. But just moving on to a slightly different aspect of this, there's another part of impalahood that many listeners will be waiting for us to discuss, which is how the animals use scent as part of this predator display and evasion strategy, because impalas are odd in having metatarsal glands just above the hind feet. And metatarsal glands are widely found in deer as well. They're differently positioned, not as conspicuously marked, and possibly different in function. And so there's no other antelope in the whole of Africa or in India. In fact, there's no bovid in the whole world that has metatarsal glands like an impala. And so people like Jonathan Kingdon, for example, have speculated that the scent produced by these glands is wafted out during bounding and kickstarting, and that the scent somehow either communicates with other individuals of the impala group or sends some sort of relevant signal to the predators involved.
Yeah.
And in the case of Jonathan Kingdon, he was so convinced that this was true that in his well-illustrated books, he even sketched the impala with sort of vapor trails coming out from behind it, which is it's a fun idea, but it's by far it's far from having been scientifically substantiated. But it's just possible that part of the function of kickstarting is to kind of blast that scent out. And because the scent is an honest expression of the actual metabolic and physiological fitness of the animal and its longer term stress levels, it may be just what it takes to persuade that predator that this particular individual is not worth following.
And am I right in saying then that in their gregariousness, rubbing gregariousness and that gregarious camouflage, the impala are working together? But as soon as they start stotting and releasing the scent and showing how well they start, it's each for their own. They actually, the strong ones are trying to indicate to the predator that there are weaker ones in the herd, and it becomes very selfish at that moment.
Yes, no, that's an absolutely valid distinction. I don't think any student of the Zahavi handicap principle would disagree with that. But you see, yeah, again, you have to frame it contextually, and the context is that many different ungulates have anti-predator fitness displays that you can broadly term stotting, and they all function in that way.
Yeah.
Whether it's a springbok doing its characteristic springbok stotting, or a mule deer which has a more sort of rigid and bouncy stot, or a hartebeest proud trotting, and there are other specialized, gaits in gazelles and so forth. What they're all trying to do at that point is to say, don't pick me, pick them. Or it's a process of self-disqualification. So it's an odd thing for the human mind to understand, because when we parade or try to impress others by our physical prowess, whether we're skateboarding or pole vaulting or whatever, we're basically saying, pick me, pick me. I want your attention on me. But when an ungulate, whether it be a mule deer or a proud trotting hartebeest, does this spectacular display. I mean, it's such fun studying stotting because it's so diverse and it's so spectacular. But what the animal is desperately trying to do is to say, stop watching me. For God's sake, stop watching me and look at somebody else, because you can see that I'm just too fit for you. Yeah. It's over the top in terms of your risk reward calculation, Mr. Predator, because you can see that the chances are that you're not going to get me and you incur the same risk in following me. So you've got to look at somebody else now. And so they're all trying to dob each other in. They're all trying to say, kill him, not me.
Yeah, yeah.
And so they're all competing with each other to be the one that's not that doesn't qualify, that is not selected for pursuit. But that is not unique to impalas. It's true for all of these. Yeah.
Sure, and it's interesting to contemplate how it's the stronger animals that are driving that behavior, because the weaker ones would prefer not to have this whole stotting thing going on.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, coming back to a more frequently observed and perhaps better understood example of a stotter, the springbok, which is basically named after its stotting behavior. It's one of the few ungulates that actually has an English name that is, or an Afrikaans name as well, that is descriptive of what it does when encountered by pursuit predators. Springbok springs, and this springing is stotting, and any member of the group that fails to stot, once one member starts to stot, is basically putting a target on their back.
Yeah,
because that's exactly how you're going to be selected, is by failing to start and failing to start aggressively enough.
It's almost like a bullying. It's this the bullies are able to dictate what everyone needs to do.
Well, I suppose you could look at it that way. But yeah, it's hard to describe in human terms because it's so different. I suppose we throw each other under the bus. There's plenty of situations in human politics and society where people throw each other under the bus. I don't think we need to come up with a particular example, but people often do that.
Yeah.
They'll throw somebody. I think that's the best way to describe it. For people to understand what stotting is in its broad sense in ungulates, bearing in mind this is mainly for pursuit and cursorial predators, not for ambushing and pouncing predators. They're trying to throw each other under the bus. That's exactly what they're doing. It's not as simple as that, because very often, for example, in the mule deer, which has been photographed and filmed stotting perhaps more than any other ungulate in the world, the mule deer usually is encountered stotting alone. You'll find a single mule deer. There's no other members of the species around, and it still stots like its life depends on it. So, biology is very, very difficult to generalize absolutely, because in that case, the stotting of the mule deer is also partly associated with clearing obstacles, and everything is complicated. But in general, stotting in ungulates is a case of trying to throw each other under the bus, because somebody's got to go. I mean, it's in the nature of the food web that somebody's going to get killed, because that's the regime, that's the order. That's why the predators are there, is because they've survived by being able to harvest that population. So somebody's going to be sacrificed. That can't be avoided. There's no adaptation that can avoid that, because that's how the food web works. Particularly if you are one of the most abundant species in the community. So impalas will be predated. That's not in question. The question is who's going to be predated, and it's going to be the weakest, or the most debilitated.
Yeah, wonderful. Coming back to the coloration of it, looking at differences between the cob and the impala. Superficially, they look the same if you were just to have a casual drive and glance at them, drive past and glance. But the impala has far greater patterning, intricate patterning. Is that right? Black markings and various parts of the body that are not as distinct or prominent or abundant on the cob, if one looks closely. Or am I?
That is very much the case. Yeah, you could characterize Buffin's cob as having more or less one of the plainest colorations that is in the the palette of options for a somewhat gregarious, somewhat open country ruminant. It's not quite as simple as that, because it has kind of rather functionally puzzling dark stripes down the front of its legs, but it's not a big deal. Basically, it's just a plain animal.
Yeah.
A counter-shaded plain fawn animal, and you have to remember that even its somewhat reddish hue is irrelevant in this context, because to all of the animals concerned, whether they be other ungulates or predators, it just looks gray in their eyes. So, yeah, you could say that Buffin's cob just tries to blend in. And that's not true for the impalas for a couple of reasons. Number one is they can't really blend in because of their gregarious. They move as such a large group that blending in is not an option anymore. And secondly, as you said, when you look at the overall impression of plainness on an impala and you start actually focusing on it, it's a remarkably dissected or compartmentalized coloration with all sorts of interesting details, many of which have never been explained. Like if you look at the front on the chest brisket area, you'll see elaborate little lobes of white, remarkably intricate little strange obscure details that don't seem to make any adaptive sense. But what we can say is that when the animals are together as a tight group, all of these bewildering details help to confuse the picture and rather frustrate a predator's attempt to distinguish one debilitated individual from the general melee.
Yeah, including the black mark of the metatarsal gland and strange black spots on the just above the hooves as well. Is that right, with the impala?
Yes, that's right. There's all sorts of little details. I mean, I've gone to great pains to try and describe and account for the adaptive coloration of impalas, but I've still got a long way to go, because there's whole patterns there that I've never really dealt with. It's somewhat paradoxical, because if you went to the average visitor to the Kruger Park, for example, and said, "Are you familiar with the impala?" Well, yes, I am. How would you describe its coloration in general? They'd say, "Well, it's plain. It's a plain colored animal," and they're not wrong. They're not wrong. But you see, and that's a meaningful observation, because they are plain compared to, for example, true plains game such as the bontebok, or even to the Serengeti wildebeest, because the Serengeti western white-bearded wildebeest doesn't have the same kind of black and white piebald coloration as the bontebok, but it is conspicuously dark. If you look at the photos and films of the migrating wildebeest in the Serengeti, what strikes you immediately is how the animals are so dark that they stand out from the grassland, whether it's in the green state or the brown state. A herd of wildebeest in the distance is immediately obvious because it's like black flies. And they don't need to be black like that. They could just be brown. So plains game in general look bold, whether they're particularly dark or particularly pale or a combination in the form of a bontebok-like piebald pattern. But the impala is not like that. It's basically plain, but plain in a funny way because it's plain in this puzzlingly intricate way that I think is best explained in the concept of gregarious camouflage.
Yeah, it's got, I'm looking at some impala here on my screen, and it's got a whitish muzzle, and it's like white socks just above the dark hooves, and then it's white tail and these black stripes on either side of the buttocks. So yeah, it's not plain when you put on this lens of looking at all the patterns. And would you agree, coming full circle, that this intricate patterning is part of the rubbing gregarious camouflage?
Yes, and it's not just camouflage. You see, this is the fascination, is that there are certain small scale patterns on the impala, which I explain as being not to do with gregarious camouflage, but instead to do with social communication.
Okay.
And I think, I'm not sure if we discussed this in our previous segment on the coloration of impalas, but whether we did or not, let's mention it again, is that there's a strange effect on the hooves, or on the, let me be more precise, on the pelage just above the hoof, in which there's a strange kind of sheen effect. Because if you were to look at a dead impala, you wouldn't notice anything particularly pale about the short fur or pelage just above the hoof. But when you see them in the field, what's strange is that there's a kind of a pale, sheeny effect just in that little stocking that happens above the hoof on all 4 feet. And what's strange about that particular sheen is that it seems to kick in whether the surface is in the sunshine or not. Even in dim light, it seems to have a sheeny quality. And the hypothesis explaining that is that it's important for the members of the group to monitor each other's whereabouts and movements. And so what arises adaptively is a thing called a pedal flag, a P-E-D-A-L flag. The word pedal comes from the ancient root for foot. So pes is a foot. And so like a pediatrician, pedestal, pediatrician, and so on. And so a pedal flag is a pattern of relatively small scale, socially orientated, conspicuous coloration on or near the feet. And this is not part of the gregarious camouflage. What it is instead another aspect of the adaptive coloration facilitating gregariousness, which is the animals are constantly trying to monitor each other as well as their environment. And so any accentuation of critical points on the anatomy, such as the feet, is tremendously helpful, because the animal can take in at a glance what everybody else is doing, where they are, how they're moving, what their footfall sequence is, and so on. And this may be particularly important at night when they congregate in open areas, because I suspect that in the very light sensitive and motion sensitive vision of impalas, that pedal flag, that slight glint of pale stockingness above their hoofs, is visible even on a moonlit night, so they can see where each other, everyone is.
Yeah. Did you say pediatrician? Is it a podiatrist?
Oh no, I think I misspoke there, because a pediatrician studies kids, not so. No. Forgive me, I'm completely wrong there. Yeah. But I think there are other words in English that use that word root pes for foot.
Yeah.
that was really dumb. That was really dumb. It's good. It's good to be dumb every now and again. It keeps one in one's place.
Okay, well, any other aspects to look at from a predation perspective, looking at Buffin's cob and impala, or have we pretty much covered the points you wanted to mention?
No, well, I think one could mention the scent glands a little more. The scent gland profiles in Buffin's cob and the common impala are surprisingly different.
Yeah.
And in Buffin's cob, there are interdigital glands. In other words, rather smelly, cheesy, smelly glands in between the two halves of the hoof on each of the 4 feet. And this is not exceptional because Buffin's cob is in line with many different ruminants in this way. Many different ruminants have interdigital glands, which are not particularly well understood, but they're located in a part of the anatomy where they can function in the most banal way, just by allowing animals to track each other. Because every time the foot is put down on the ground, it leaves a bit of scent in that track location.
Yeah.
And so, it's a kind of an unremarkable gland system. But what's amazing about impalas is they've lost that completely. They have nothing like that going. And in fact, impalas have lost most of the glands you'd expect them to have because Buffin's cob has slightly developed preorbital glands, which did not occur in impalas. Preorbital glands, again, are a kind of stock-in-trade gland for a ruminant, found in many different clades of ruminants, but absolutely gone from impalas. The Buffin's cob has inguinal glands in the crotch, which are absolutely gone from impalas. And so in impalas, there's only basically 2 glandular systems left. One is the metatarsal gland, which is very specialized. And the other is a broad glandular surface on the forehead, just in mature males in the breeding season. It's a kind of again, it's somewhat paradoxical because it's specific to breeding males, but it's also not really a gland that you can put your finger on because it's just the smelliness of the secretions of that whole patch of pelage on the forehead that is then rubbed on bushes. And that's not all that surprising because quite a few other ruminants have something similar to that. So what it really boils down to is that Buffin's cob is much more normal in its glandular profile than the impala, which is distinctly peculiar, specialized for metatarsal glands. And when you consider the function of the metatarsal glands, there's something really interesting going on there that Jonathan Kingdon's predictions notwithstanding, we still don't understand. Nobody really has been able to study what actually happens when the metatarsal glands puff out their intriguing scent, particularly in the case of fleeing and bounding and stotting.
There's not a microbial culture going on in that gland, is there?
That's an interesting point. You and I were looking a few weeks ago at the fact that in the was it in the white-tailed deer?
Yeah.
Yes, even the white-tailed deer which is a very well-known and almost mundane ruminant in North America. They have an extremely interesting situation where on the inner surface of what is analogous to the ankle, to the human ankle, which is the hock on the hind leg, there's a little patch of hairs which functions glandularly, as it were, but is not actually glandular. What it is, it's a funny little patch, like 2 or 3 centimeters diameter, that has a kind of a strange hair texture. And what both the males and the females do in the white-tailed deer is they squat in such a manner when micturating, when passing urine, that urine dribbles onto that patch of fur.
Yeah.
And then there's something about the skin under there that isn't actually glandular, but encourages microbial infestation and microbial processing of the urine and the hormones in the urine and so on to form a very smelly, almost toxically smelly patch that then presumably functions mainly in the sociosexual behavior of the white-tailed deer. And what's peculiar about this is 2 things. Number one is it functions as a sort of a hyper gland without actually having glandular physiology, because it's gathering materials from elsewhere and sort of concentrating and processing them on site. And number 2 is that it's one of the few glands that if you're butchering an animal that you've slaughtered, like after hunting a white-tailed deer, you need to be wary of, because if you skin a white-tailed deer carelessly and whatever that microbial filth is on that metatarsal gland contaminates your meat, you can actually poison yourself or at least get a bad stomach. So,
yeah,
people are savvy about white-tailed deer hunting. They know that they have to avoid that thing. Don't mess with that because it's filthy.
Yeah, you called it a metatarsal gland there, but it's not. It's on the hock. It's in a different position, is it or not? Or
Yes.
is it
Again, I misspoke. You forgive me. It's actually a tarsal gland. It's actually a tarsal gland. And that's an important mistake because the white-tailed deer also has a metatarsal gland, a much less interesting and spectacular one than in the impala. But the white-tailed deer has both. It has a metatarsal gland and a tarsal gland. Quite right. Thank you for pulling me up on that. Yeah.
No, I just wasn't sure. So the impala is unlikely to be using a microbial brew, as it were. It's more likely that the metatarsal gland is just a normal gland pumping out scent that the impala's made, as opposed to microbes.
That is what I understand. I can't say I've either studied it myself or read any particular literature on it, but I think everybody accepts that what that metatarsal gland in impalas is a kind of a little bare spot, a bare glandular spot surrounded by a stiff raised brush of dark, blackish pelage. But it has a flaring capacity. In other words, when the animal runs, there's a certain dermal musculature in there that it allows almost like a pumping action where that sort of cup of kind of pumps the these are difficult things to describe, pumps the scent into the air. It's most intriguing, and maybe someday somebody will study it in detail, but that's the way
I don't think most visitors would imagine that these animals have a perfume of sorts and that they're pumping out the perfume as they run.
Well, that's right. I mean, some of these perfumes of antelopes are quite detectable to the human nose, but there's a large variety of them. I mentioned before that the interdigital glands often tend to be very smelly to people, cheesy, but it's difficult to generalize because other glands on ruminants smell almost floral, or they smell pretty neutral, or, it's not easy. Like, for example, with klipspringers, which are renowned for dabbing sticks with their preorbital gland secretions. Because I grew up in the Cape Mountains of South Africa, I often could smell relatively fresh pastings of that material on the fynbos plants. It had a lovely sort of mild aromatic smell, certainly not offensive. So, the field of glands, external glands in ruminants is something you could study for the rest of your life and write many books about. It's a complex, nuanced, fascinating, multifaceted thing. And I think with respect to the anti-predator strategy of impalas, we don't really understand it. It's a major question. Is firstly, why are impalas so specialized in having just this one really odd gland, the metatarsal gland? And secondly, how does it actually work? There's no evidence that it works sociosexually in terms of roughing behavior or mating behavior or anything like that, or courtship. It seems to be an anti-predator thing, but how it works is anybody's guess, really.
Fascinating. Wow. Perhaps in parting, Anthony, we could just briefly discuss your view on how fast the hunting dog runs after the impala. We were both fascinated to see how fast those domestic dogs were running after a rabbit. I think somewhere in the UK, a drone image. It was quite astounding. It seemed like they were both animals, the two dogs and the rabbit were sprinting for many minutes, and we didn't actually see either animal tire because the rabbit seemed to escape into the bushes. But given that we were watching a dog there, I'm wondering whether the hunting dog is running at a sprinting speed at times when trying to chase the impala down, or do you think it's a relatively slow jog where it just exhausts the animal?
No, I don't think. No, I don't think it's a slow jog that exhausts the animal. But I'm just guessing. It's a very interesting question, and like we mentioned in a previous segment, the one on locomotion, it's a real puzzle as to what the game is between the impala and the African hunting dog. But I suppose I can just shoot the breeze by introducing a few ideas here. That out-and-out sprint, which I recommend every listener look up on the web. It's a most spectacular thing in which a drone has filmed two individuals of the domestic dog chasing a hare across an extended open landscape, with the hare finally escaping by encountering a patch of bush, of hedge work, like gorse, and disappearing into it, which I think flummoxed the dogs. But what was remarkable about this, as you said, was that it's almost heart-stoppingly awesome to witness this extended, all-out, deadly sprint between predator and prey. The hare, the valiant little hare, going absolutely flat stick for miles, and the dog's absolutely determined to keep up. And in every case, over several different episodes of this same single chase, actually catching up with the hare, because the dogs have a slight advantage, only a slight advantage, but it only takes a 1% advantage for them actually to catch up after maybe 200 or 300 meters, 400 meters. And then the hare surviving every time by just taking an abrupt turn to the left or right that the dogs can't match, which means they have to start playing catch up again. I don't think that's the kind of dynamic that happens with impalas, if only for the reason that impalas tend to live in habitat that's not flat and open like that. So it's not really practicable for there to be that all-out life and death, heart-stoppingly extreme, desperate contest, because that's what we witnessed. The hare, which was Lepus europaeus, which is like a hare about the size of a domestic cat, about 3 kilograms. And the dogs involved were maybe 10, 20 kilograms, just, medium-sized dogs. What we witnessed there was a contest of nature in which it was just speed, endurance, and maneuverability in the raw. It was life and death in the most primeval contest of the most basic skills of pursuit and flight, right? But I think what happens with the African hunting dog and the impala is much more mysterious and nuanced and almost difficult to hypothesize about, because you have to factor in the complexities of the initial choice of quarry and the various obstacles in the environment, the fact that the impala might leap over a bush and delay the process of being tracked and followed by the pursuer. You've got to factor in the risks involved, because the African hunting dog, like most minor predators in the African savannas, is always mindful, we must assume, of the risk of attracting bigger predators, because, as we know, the lion and the spotted hyena will always cheerfully capitalize on any opportunity to catch the African hunting dog off guards and kill it with enormous joy and and satisfaction. So I just don't know. I think I acknowledged my ignorance in a previous segment, and I still just don't know how it works. But it's not just an all-out, flat-out chase like that. It's something much interesting. And maybe we'll.
Do you think it? Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
No, carry on. Yeah.
So you also don't think it's something like the Khoisan chasing down a kudu, which is just keep doing it for hours until the kudu tires and you can basically walk up to the animal. That's how the humans hunt the kudu, according to some documentaries. I wonder if the impala tires such that the hunting dog can just basically walk up to it at the end of the hunt.
It's possible, but I doubt it. I think that strategy is followed by the spotted hyena. And I suspect many biologists familiar with the spotted hyena would agree that one of the strategies, not the only one, of the spotted hyena is to do that, is to scan a group. And I think the spotted hyena, again, is very scanning oriented. It's going to stand back at a distance and it's going to have a good, hard look at a group, whether it be zebra, wildebeest, hartebeest, topee. Those are the kinds of animals that it's worth chasing. It wouldn't do this kind of chase for a gazelle because the reward is not big enough. It needs an animal of more than 100 kilos to make this whole gambit worth it. Because the spotted hyena is interesting in sometimes hunting solitary and sometimes hunting gregariously. For example, in Serengeti, what happens with mothers of the spotted hyena is that they go on long foraging trips all by themselves. And what they do is they come, because they leave their young behind. The young are adapted in the spotted hyena to fasting for long periods, like days on end without milk. They put in a shallow burrow, but with a narrow aperture so that other predators can't get them. And the babies, the infants just hang in there. They hang in there sometimes for several days without a drop of milk or water or anything. And they don't come out of that burrow. They just wait and they wait and they wait. And their valiant mama goes out there sometimes for, I don't know, it could be up to 100 kilometers for all I know. They're right, sort of, across a good section of the Serengeti. Because what happens is, like most carnivores, including in the Serengeti, the carnivores are sedentary in their breeding habits. This idea that carnivores follow the migratory herds is not true. Certainly not in terms of reproducing as they follow them. Whether it's the lion or the spotted hyena or the African hunting dog, all of them breed in a particular place. And that means that if the wildebeest migration is somewhere else, tens of kilometers somewhere else, that mama has to go out and get them. It has to first find that migrating population, which can be like a whole day or 2 days commute away. It has to get one, and then it can't bring it back. It's too big. So it fills up, it swells up its belly, and then it lopes home with two amazing things. It's got a full belly, and now it's also got a full udder because it's producing milk, and it actually looks like a cow's udder. And so this mother spotted hyena comes all the way back and gives the desperate infant the meal that ensures its survival. But the point I'm trying to make is that because of that strategy, and because of the fact that the females are the main sex in the spotted hyena, they're bigger, they're butcher, they're the better hunters in that particular species. It's inevitable that many of the kills performed by the spotted hyena are going to be performed alone, and that's what the spotted hyena does a lot of the time. Not all of the time. It's not an exclusive thing, but because, for example, when they hunt the plains zebra, they will tend to gang up in a kind of a strange way, which we don't need to go into here. But for hunting, say, wildebeest or topi, what the spotted hyena does is it takes a good hard look to find that animal that's just a little bit off peak, just a little bit lame, a little bit old, a little bit young, a little bit something, and then it just goes after it, and it doesn't sprint. It just goes after it. It goes after it. And there is a contest of supreme endurance, because both the alsalafan antelopes, wildebeest, topi, Coke's hartebeest, and so on, and the spotted hyena are supremely designed anatomically for endurance, both speed and endurance, but more endurance. And in the case of the spotted hyena, it's got this amazingly flexible hind foot and ankle that gives it a very strange motion when running. And it's perfectly plausible that that's how the spotted hyena does it. It just keeps on going after it until it can actually get a latch on the foot. And once the spotted hyena with its clamp-like jaws gets hold of the skin of the quarry, then basically it's game over. So, but you see, that whole scenario doesn't really apply to the impalas. In my view. Yeah, I can't see that ever unfolding in the case of impalas for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah. So the hunting dog are perhaps chasing the impala, waiting for the impala to make a misstep, a misjudgment, not getting around a bush as fast as it had hoped, and the hunting dog can then take it out. So they're looking for a mistake, are they, as opposed to an endurance hunt?
Well, I'm embarrassed to say I can't even take a guess at that. I don't want to pretend to understand this any better than I do. I think it's just a genuinely interesting question. There may be carnivore biologists out there, maybe Gus Mills or something like that, people with a lot of experience who would have a competent answer, but I'm not one of them. I just don't get it. I just don't get it. I mean, maybe the answer is this, Anthony, that given the realities of the multi-species predatory community with which the impala has contended for millions of years, the impala doesn't really care. The population it doesn't really matter whether the population suffers predation from the African hunting dog, because the African hunting dog is never that common in any particular patch of impala habitat that it's going to be the deciding species, because the impala has to deal with all of the predators. It has to deal with the lion, the leopard, the cheetah, the spotted hyena, even in some cases smaller species in case of predation on the babies, and humans as well. And maybe its strategy is that it hasn't evolved to be particularly adept at evading the African hunting dog, because the African hunting dog is normally a minor and rather intermittent part of these communities. For example, in the Serengeti, I was working in the Serengeti at a time where it just so happened that there was a pack of the African hunting dog operating in the Masai Mara, and everybody piled in there and photographed it and filmed it, and it was great. And people thought, oh, great, the African hunting dog has come back to the Serengeti ecosystem. And then that group just died. The population dynamics of the African hunting dog are disappointingly volatile. Like, they'll breed up well, and then they seem to be doing great, chasing wildebeest all over the place. And then you find they've all died of distemper or some misfortune. They're gone, and maybe gone for decades. So they're not a species that you can really bank on. And but you see, that explanation that the impala just basically takes it on the chin and copes with an inevitable toll to the African hunting dog as a minor toll in its overall equation of risk, doesn't jive with my other hypothesis, which is that it's actually developed a specialized display towards this particular predator. Yeah. So listeners will conclude that this is an incompetent discussion, but you see, the point is not to answer the questions. The point is to raise the questions, because until these questions are clearly formulated, there's a chance that they'll never be answered.
Yeah, hopefully this discussion gets listened to by a drone operator who now has a search image for trying to get the hunting dog chasing impala on drone. That'd be quite something to see.
I think that has been done by accident on several occasions, but yes, I agree, it should be done advertently. We need people with drone expertise actually to make this a bit of a mission. Get a population of impalas that live with a population of wild dogs and make a mission of it. Just get out there and try and figure out how this thing works.
Yeah. Wonderful. Okay, on that optimistic note of technology to the rescue of hypothesizing, anything else to add, Anthony, or should we draw the part 4 of our series to a close?
No, we may as well draw it to a close, because we could go on for hours and days. It's also fascinating, and one topic always ramifies into others and so forth. But yeah, for now, that's wonderful. To listeners, thanks for listening and watching. Like, subscribe, and share, and we look forward to discussing all sorts of delicious topics in our next presentation. And over and out for now.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.